Hello and welcome to this tutorial on how to sculpt a head in clay part 1. Or if you want to sound fancy about it, we're going to be sculpting a bust. So let's talk about our tools and materials first. I'm going to be using just two types of Chavant clay, medium and hard. Hard being for really small details like eyes and ears, really fragile bits. Here's a bunch of the tools I'll be using, starting with the big ones on the left for blocking things out. The ones in the middle are things like rakes for refining the features, and then the smallest ones on the right are going to be used for detailing. So the first and most important tool you're going to want to use is your hands, but second to that is a really nice large wood palette knife for shifting the clay around, making aggressive cuts to block in the shape of your sculpt. These are some rake tools, and it's kind of like using really coarse sandpaper. It gets rid of all the extra bits of clay that are sticking out and just evens out the surface. You'll want to use this just before your cleanup pass. These are some loop tools for both cleaning up the sculpt and adding in details. If you want these things to last longer, because they're kind of fragile, which is kind of unfortunate for how expensive they are, you can put some 5-minute epoxy on the ends of them where the loops plug in, and that'll stabilize them a lot more and make them last way longer. Next up, you're going to need a cheap small paintbrush with the ends cut off. That's going to be used for scrubbing in the solvents that are for smoothing the sculpt out. The middle one is a loop tool for adding in wrinkles, and the final one is a hook tool also for wrinkles and working on other small details like pores and stuff. Finally, here's what we're going to be using to give everything a nice smooth finish. On the left is an alcohol torch just for melting the surface a bit and giving everything a nice bit of a sheen. Second from the left is this great stuff called taltine, which does a fantastic job of breaking down the clay while not being too toxic like the other solvents like turpentine or terpenoid. I'll mix that next with some isopropyl alcohol, just so it's not too strong and doesn't turn the clay to complete mud. And finally, on the far right is some air duster, which is used for cooling any clay melted from the alcohol torch. Alright, let's get started. If you haven't seen any of my other videos, to get your clay workable, you can either put it in a toaster oven, or sometimes I'll just use a hair dryer just to warm it up a bit. It's nice to work with soft clay so you don't hurt your hands and you can work a lot faster. So first, roll up an egg shape to represent the cranium. I'm trying to work with your hands as long as possible. It's just faster and way more immediate. As soon as you start using tools, you can get a little bit finicky and slow down a bit. So as soon as that egg shape's made, I'll slide a large plane of clay onto the narrow side of it. This will represent the face. So think about how short or wide or long you want it, since this will dictate the final look of your character. I'm thinking for this guy, I'd like him to be a little slender and narrow, and maybe in the next video I'll do like a short, stout dude, just to show how focusing on the shape of the skull at this point will determine the final result. Okay, I've got the head in the general shape that I want. Now it's time to add in a neck and some shoulders. We're going to pose this guy later on, so just the slightest head tilt can give your piece a lot more character. To do the neck, just roll up a large tube and plug it in from the base of the skull to under the jaw. Just like the head, I'm going to make it a little bit long to emphasize that this is a skinny guy. With your base neck on, throw on a couple thin tubes for the sternomastoid muscles. They don't need to be super exact since you're going to refine them later. You can see I'm using both my hands at the same time here, trying to get some sort of symmetry down. Symmetry can be tricky since there's definitely no mirror function like you'd find in ZBrush. If you want to check if you're on the right track and not getting too lopsided, try looking at it in the mirror and it'll expose everything that's wrong with your sculpt. Somehow the brain just works that way where it catches mistakes once things are flipped. Alright, starting to use my first tool, the wood palette knife. You'll want to use this just like a pencil in figure drawing class, doing gestural big strokes and drawing on the divisions in between the muscles. This isn't for finessing anything yet, it's just for determining the length and locations of all your forms and making quick adjustments. Next up, I'm laying out two tubes to represent the clavicle. These are really important parts. Anything with a bony landmark is crucial because those are the indications of where you're going to start linking up different muscles. For example, I could link up the sternomastoids to the middle of that clavicle and know it's going to the right spot. So you're kind of playing connect the dots between areas. They're also important because without them, the anatomy can feel pretty formless if it's all just muscles and no bones underneath. So now that I know where those clavicles are, I can start linking things to them just like a puzzle. They'll end up going out to the shoulders and meet the scapula, which I'll then connect the shoulder muscles to. So everything's just going to link together. It's not shown here, but you'll want to block out the general size and width of the shoulders before doing any of these link ups and details like bones or muscles. You don't want to put any work into those things and then find out that your overall proportions are wrong, like the head's too large or the body's too small, that sort of thing. So block in first before going into any detail. I just wasn't sure at the time how much of this model I wanted to build or how far I wanted his chest to go. That's why I didn't end up blocking in it at first. I'm still just blocking things out and shifting stuff around with that spatula tool, adding some more mass to the back. I thought that the neck seemed a little too short. I really wanted to go for a long character, so I ended up chopping the head off and then extending it a bit. This is one of the advantages of not having an armature. If you want to make big changes, it's totally possible. And with a model of this kind, all that clay packed together, you don't really need to worry about an armature because it's all going to hold together. After a while, the clay can get pretty hard and tough to work with, so just warm it up with a hair dryer and that'll soften things up so you can start smoothing it down with your fingers. When it gets too messy and lumpy like this, it's good to take stock of what you've got and just smooth everything down. Remember to smooth along the muscle group so you're not eradicating any forms. He's going to need a lot more mass on that trapezius just to round the back out. These are still just block-in shapes, but you'll see I actually start using that rake tool to refine things a bit. It's also helpful to draw in with that spatula tool again. Once you've drawn in your lines, take like a rake tool or a loop tool and pull out from that line on either side, and that'll kind of instantly round off and give you shape to your muscles. All right, now that we've got the general shape of the whole sculpt locked in, we can start blocking out the skull. I'm just going to draw a line straight down the middle to define the middle of the face. Next, I'm going to draw a horizontal line halfway down the face, and that's going to indicate where the eye sockets are going to go. Do another horizontal line halfway down that, and that's going to indicate the bottom of the nose. Once that's done, use your loop tool and dig out a couple eye sockets. So go just above that first line you drew in. Since the eyes are going to go straight in the middle, you want the eye sockets to go up a little bit higher. After the eye sockets, I'm going to carve out a little notch that's going to indicate the top of the brow bone. I'm also going to go into those eye sockets near the nose and just carve out a little indentation on either side. This is just going to kind of indicate where the nasal bone is going to go. And next up, we're going to add some cheekbones. And remember that these attach to around the hole in the ear. So you kind of bring them directly back and try and imagine where that hole in the ear is going to be and connect those up. I'm also going to carve out a little indentation concave part for his temples there. So I was hoping that this wouldn't show up in the video, but yes, I am wearing a headband a la Olivia Newton-John's hit video Physical. It helps keep the hair out of the way. If you don't know Physical, I guess Karate Kid. I'm going to make that area by the eye sockets near the nose even deeper, just to even emphasize the cheekbones a little bit more. I'm also going to lengthen the chin. He's still just not looking long enough for me. I actually go in later again and chop the head in two and add even more clay. Just really wanted to make him look long. And here's some ears, just a block in. Like everything else, they're going to get refined later. So just roll up a little oval and squish it into the side of the head directly in the middle there, and just carve it out, just so we get a sense that they're just block-in ears. Nothing fancy. Also remember to put them on at a slight angle. They actually don't go straight up and down. As much as I stress the importance of modeling this skull, you don't need to go in and literally model it to the T, but you definitely want to indicate the areas that are big bony landmarks that actually show up on the surface of the face, like the cheekbones and the brow bones, stuff like that. But you don't need to go in and model teeth or anything like that if they're not going to be visible on your model. You could almost think of this whole sculpting process like building a house. First you put up the wood framework, and that would be your skeleton. Once that's all done, then you put up the drywall, and that would be your muscles. Finally, when that's all done, you move in and you put up the blinds and hang up the pictures, and that would be the little details, like your eyelashes or creases in the lip, that sort of thing. So you wouldn't want to move into a house and put up all the pictures and the blinds before the drywall. So you got to go step by step and build everything up in layers. With the eyes and the cheekbones blocked in, you can add a little barrel shape above the chin to indicate where the mouth is going to go. You don't want to just put lips on a flat face. You want to indicate that there's actually teeth behind them, pushing them out a bit. To put on the nose, it's basically just a big triangle shape with the ends blended into the cheeks. You'll also want to specify that little bump in the nose where the skull ends and the cartilage begins. I'm also using that end of that loop tool to shift the clay around. The smaller the body part, the smaller the tools you're going to have to use. So you just keep working tinier and tinier. Also, at this point, don't get too discouraged if it looks funky right now. There's going to be a large section of time on your sculpting where things just look muddy and messy, and you just got to have faith that you're going to pull it all together at the end. Here's that notch in the nose that I was talking about. I kind of want this guy to have a bit of a boxer's nose, really wide and flat. Here's that compressed air held upside down. If your sculpt's getting a little too muddy and you're having a hard time making out the details and shifting things around, hit it with this spray and it'll harden everything up, and you can actually start carving out shapes. So when things get too messy, just hit it with that spray. These two little bumps at the end of the nose are called the alar cartilage, and those will kind of give you that bulbous end that you see on any nose, really. They're basically teardrop shapes, and they blend back in right behind on top of the nostrils. You can see putting them on instantly, he doesn't have that pointy nose anymore. You'll notice I'm not working on the eyes yet, and probably wondering, for God's sake, when is he going to get to those? Put something in them. I like to hold off on the eyes until the very last moment. I think if you can get a lot of character out of your sculpt without having eyes in, then I think when you do add the eyes in, that's kind of like an icing on the cake. So try and get as far as you can, and give enough character that you can get the gist of who this person is without having fancy eye expressions. Another good reason for holding off is if you're trying to capture somebody's likeness. If you don't have eyes in yet and you can tell who that person is already, then you're going to be in really good shape later on. Things start to get a little more finicky at this point. The further along in the process, the more the subtle changes become important. It's now about taking those basic shapes we put down and then working them until they resemble their final forms. It's good to clean up any smaller shapes that you put down with a loop tool, just so you can distinguish all the different elements more clearly. If everything's just a gestural mess, it can be hard to tell what's supposed to be on there and what's just an accident. Starting to flush out those cheeks a little bit and add some more shape to his chin as well. With those loop tools, by the way, these things, I tell you, I've been through maybe 10 of them, and considering a pack is about $40, it's pretty heartbreaking to have to go back to the store and buy some more of them. So reinforce them with that epoxy glue if you can. Alright, it's finally time to give this guy a mouth. So draw a line indicating where you want it to be. Usually it's about 2/3 of the way up. It's closer to the nose than it is the chin. Once you've got that in there, use your wooden tool there and just push up that upper lip to form it up. Just going to redefine that line again. Once that upper lip is done, for the bottom lip, actually carve out a little ledge to it. So you're not going to be pushing it with your tool, you're actually just carving it out. It's going to look a little funky for a while, and you just need to keep on shaping it. So once you've got your overall size and shape, you can start adding in bits of clay, that little middle bump to the lip, that sort of thing. And just like if you're drawing a face, you'd want the corners of the mouth to be a bit darker. So I'm going to carve out a little indent there just to express that. There's also two little teardrop shapes that go on the sides of the mouth. Putting those on will also add a lot more meatiness and a lot more depth to the corners of the mouth. While I'm just trying to refine these lips, I should say that as you're adding on all this kind of meat and mass, it's important not to lose that general kind of skull shape that you originally put down. So try not to go too far where it all disappears and you lose that original work you put in. Now we're on to my favorite part of the face, these two big puffy parts on either side of the lips. I'm not sure why I like them so much. There's this amazing animation called Ninja Scroll by a studio called Madhouse, and they always accentuate this part, and it just makes their characters look super tough and burly. It's awesome. When you're doing the lips, they kind of lock together like a puzzle piece. The top one has that middle bump, so I'll throw that in there, and then the bottom lip has two bumps that kind of encase that top lip part. So I'm just going to keep on refining this and working on the shape of the lips for a while, and then once that's done, we'll move on to doing the ears. Okay, there we go. The first pass at the mouth. It's not perfect by any means, but at least it doesn't look like Deadpool from that crappy Wolverine movie. So moving on to the ear now, carve out the blocked out shape you made earlier and then just start adding in those smaller elements like the ear lobes. That outermost ring around the ear is called the helix, and that wraps around and tapers off at the whole of the ear. So just roll up a tube of clay to describe that part. You could almost think of the ear as all these echo chambers, and all these weird folds are just channeling sounds into the whole of the ear. This is a good part to start using that harder clay on. You'll find with smaller bits like this ear, just knocking your arm against it accidentally can just ruin it completely. So having the harder clay just makes it last longer. Also, you can carve in those little details a little bit better. With that outer helix put in and we've got the lobe, now I'm going to put on, it's called the anti-helix. It's a very fancy name. It's the bigger shape on the inner side of the ear. And with that in, on the very top, I'm just going to carve out just a little indent on it. That tool, by the way, is a ball stylus. It's just good for pushing clay around and doing little holes like nostrils and stuff. Okay, we've put enough work into this guy that he's sufficiently deserving of a base. Not a very fancy base, it's just a piece of plywood and a couple nails. I'm going to melt the bottom of them so he can sink into it, and when it cools, it'll harden and have a really good grip on those nails, and it won't tip off. If you're not liking how ghetto this looks, this just bare base, these can actually look pretty good if you paint them white. It gives it a much classier look. I'm just too lazy to do that right now. Okay, this is very exciting. We're finally going to put in some eyes. So roll up a couple of balls small enough to fit into the sockets, and then hold them into place with any kind of tool and hit them with that freeze spray. This will ensure they don't turn into little ovals when you push them into the head. That eye on the left there is just a temp eyeball, by the way. Things are going to look a little crazy for the next few minutes. It's just going to be a man with no eyelids. Next up, melt the insides of the sockets a bit, and this will keep the eyes from popping back out as you place them in. Here's that ball stylus tool again. I'm just going to make myself some little pupils there and take out that temp eyeball. And just like the other one, I'm going to melt the insides of it and plug in a proper one. You might want to put the eyeballs in a little bit deeper than normal, just because once the eyelids are on, all that clay can make them look a little bit bulgy. So this is a very finicky part and it may take a few tries. Roll up a very tiny bit of clay and run it along just touching the bottom of the pupil and then flatten it into place. It'll be kind of a balance between pushing it on hard enough so it sticks, but not too hard that you deform the eye or the lid. And I'll do that with the second one now. The reason I prefer to do this method of laying down the specific parts as opposed to just carving out the entire eye out of the clay is it can be a bit tricky to both carve out a perfect sphere as well as put in the pupil underneath those eyelids. Do the same thing now for the top eyelid. Remember its angle is a little bit steeper on the inner part of the eye. And then just chop off that extra bit. Once those are on, you might have to go in and add a little bit more clay to that top eyelid since it actually juts out further than the bottom one. And you'll notice it's literally micromillimeters between making your character look sleepy or too excited. So how you lay down that top eyelid is very important. Once the lids are in, roll up another piece of clay and fill up that gap between the eye socket and the lower eyelid. And then obviously do the same for the other eye. Sometimes it's kind of cool if things aren't perfectly symmetrical, so don't worry too much if what you do on the left isn't exactly the same as what you do on the right. Human beings aren't perfectly symmetrical in the first place anyways, so it's always kind of cool to see like a crooked nose or that sort of thing. Next up is the lacrimal gland, and it's that small teardrop shaped gland starting under the eyebrow and then tapering off towards the nose. And that'll sort of blend everything together from the eyebrows to the eyes. Speaking of eyebrows, there's plenty of ways you can do them. Some people sculpt in each individual hair strand and others represent them as just large stylized shapes. It's totally up to you how you want to do them. I saw in some makeup magazine once that for the perfect eyebrow shape, draw a straight line from the side of the nose through the iris and then out to the eyebrow. Wherever that line hits, that's where you should put the top arch of that eyebrow. Don't ask why I was reading that magazine. It must have been in a dentist's office, I swear. These calipers are a really helpful tool for making sure your proportions are still correct. Here I'm just checking that the eyes are still in the center of the head. There's certain rules you can go by no matter what sort of head you're sculpting, like that the face is about 5 eyes across, the nose ends halfway between the eyes and the chin, things like that. These calipers will just help you verify everything. I'm going to start using this rake tool more often now. It's great for just getting rid of any big lumpy bits and smoothing things down. Make sure when you do use it that you go in kind of random directions. If you keep going in the same directions, you can actually leave in these rake marks and that'll be kind of hard to remove later. Alright, let's give this guy some hair. He's going to get a helmet later on, but I figured I'd play it safe in case I wanted to remove it. When you're doing hair, it's good to break it down into large, broad shapes instead of trying to texture each individual strand. This will help it read better from a distance, it'll give you more volume, and it'll keep it from looking too flat. So start by rolling up some reasonable sized chunks of clay and just have fun styling it and pushing it around. Just like the rest of the head, it's all about blocking something in you like and then figuring out the details later. This guy's going to get a little buzz cut, by the way, very long on the top and then short on the side. I'm going to go for a military look. If you're having a hard time, by the way, establishing a direction for your hair to flow in, try and find where the crown at the back of the head is going to be and then radiate your hair out from that point. And that might, give you a little bit of a better direction to go on.
I'm going back in now with a even finer rake tool. You just keep getting smaller and smaller. You don't want to just plow over everything with a big tool. His nose, by the way, is feeling a little too bulbous, so I'm going to go in later and tone it down with a loop tool. When you're working on smaller scale models, sometimes that extra bit of clay can just be too much, and you got to take it down later. Now that everything's raked down, we can actually start smoothing. So grab your acid brush, dip it in a mix of alcohol and taltine or whatever solvent you want to use, and just start scrubbing the surface down in a circular motion. Since this is an oil-based clay, the alcohol or whatever you're using is just going to break it right down and you can really smooth it out. If you're getting a dusty look like what I'm kind of getting here, you're probably using too much alcohol or maybe a cheaper kind of alcohol. That's no big deal. Just burn it off with the alcohol torch and it'll go away right away. This can be kind of a balance when you're using these solvents. Too little in amount, it'll have no effect, and too much, it'll just break the clay right down to unusable mud. So you may have to play around with it a bit. For me, I find probably about 60% alcohol, 40% taltine works the best. I was just using some cheesecloth there to scrub the surface down. It was just dipped in that mixture as well. It's a great way of smoothing because you can actually feel the surface of your sculpt and kind of push the surface around, simultaneously smoothing it at the same time. You could use like a sock or an old rag, anything will do. This whole smoothing process can be frustrating a little bit, so stick with it. You can find sometimes that mistakes only show through once everything's smoothed down. And then you got to go back in and clean it up again. It becomes unsmoothed, and then you've got to smooth it again, and then you find more mistakes. So it can take a while. Just keep at it, and you'll just plug through it eventually. I'm going to start putting some clothes on him now. As I mentioned in the other videos, there's a few ways you can go about doing this. You could roll up a super flat sheet of clay with a pasta roller and drape it over your model. Or as I like to do, you could model the cloth in chunks like you would just the rest of the body with big blobs of clay and then refine those shapes later. You may find with the sheet method that the clay will just rip on you, and even though you think it would just lay onto the surface and instantly create all these awesome folds, it just doesn't work as well as you'd want it to. I find with this blockout method that you have more control, and having that extra clay thickness on there will help you carve out wrinkles and folds later on. As I was making the clothes, I just bent that head slightly. Sorry I didn't film that part. Just posing like a bust, just grab the head and bend it in the direction you want. It's as simple as that. The neck may get a little bit messed up. You just got to clean it up again, that's all. In terms of who this character is, I'm kind of coming up with this concept as I go, which I'm not going to lie is not the greatest idea. It really helps if you've got a clear goal in mind of what you want to achieve. Even do up some drawings. Any prep helps. In terms of who this character is, I'm kind of coming up with it as I go. While it's totally cool to just wing it and sketch out something spontaneously, it really helps to have a clear goal in mind of what you want to achieve. So even do up some drawings, find lots of reference. Any prep helps, just so you don't go too far in a direction that you're not happy with. Some guys like Simon Lee, they can just wing up, a masterpiece out of thin air. But for us mere mortals, doing a bit of prep, it can really help. for this strap, I'm going to try and establish that it's made of two different materials, kind of a tougher, sturdier fabric on top, and then a puffier cotton material underneath. So I'm just going to go in and sculpt some folds where the upper parts are pinching down on the cotton, and then later I'll go in and add kind of a proper texture on top of the whole thing. Wherever I've put down those little seam lines, I'm going to go in and add in a few small folds where the fabric is bunching up where it's been sewn down. I find just pressing the end of a wood tool into the clay at random intervals along that seam gives the impression of those folds, even though it's not super accurate. It looks all right from a distance. I had gone back in and made some changes to his face, like scaling down that kind of bulbous end to his nose. I took in his underbite a bit, things like that. As I mentioned before, when that happens, it can get a little bit messed up, and you just got to go back in and smooth it down again. You can see here, one of my old socks has been relegated to the rag bin now. It works just as well as a cheesecloth. You might notice here that the neck is kind of cracking off a bit. That's absolutely no big deal. To fix that, you can either melt either ends of the clay and just plug them back together and hit them with some freeze spray, or draw an X along that cracked line and then fill it in with a little blob of clay, and that'll just fuse the whole two pieces back together again. Here's that hook tool I showed at the beginning. This is great for just adding in tiny little details like wrinkles, and little pores and stuff like that. Be careful when you smooth this stuff down that you go very light with your alcohol or other solvents, because it'll just wipe those right out. It'll take them right off the surface there. I'm going to start making some other little props for him. This will be a little shoulder pack. Same process as doing the rest of the clothing. You kind of make your seam lines in areas, and then you emphasize those folds. This is kind of a fun part here, adding texture to your model. I wanted this strap to have a pretty accurate looking surface to it. So I literally took a piece of a backpack. I'm going to melt the clay just slightly, and then I'm going to press it right into the strap. And that'll give it just instantly a cool little pattern. You don't need to do any more work on it. Sometimes it can stick to the clay, so it can be good to just hit it with that freeze spray so it pulls off a little bit more easily. And there you go. It's a strap. Watch out after you've smoothed your sculpt down for any areas that have gotten too soft. Like folds should definitely have pinch points to them, and then taper off smoothly. So you may need to go back in with your loop tool and just tighten things up by just pulling out the edges there. So you can see here, anywhere that's gotten too soft, I'm just tidying it up a bit. Here's something you can try if you want to add some pores and skin detail. Cover your model with cling film and then press into the surface with any sort of sponge. This will give it kind of a mottled effect. The saran wrap keeps the marks from being too harsh and kind of rounds the pores out. So the thicker the wrap, the rounder the marks will be. Say if you wanted to do a really deep wrinkles on an old person, You could use your hook tool with a thick Ziploc bag and it'll make really nice rounded lines. You have to be careful with this though, in adding skin detail. It's one of those things where you have to go all in if you're going to do it. If you start adding them in some areas and then leave others totally bare, it can look kind of weird. Also, pores are different sizes and frequencies and depths all over the face. So if you use stamps that are too large, it'll blow the scale and give your model kind of a noisy, cratery look. All right, we're more or less out of the woods with working on the face and the clothing for now. So I'm going to make this guy a few tiny little props. I always like adding tiny hard surface details to the model just to add a little bit more character. It's not the best idea to try and do sharp, hard-lined props in clay. That's just not what it was made for. If you want to cheat, and I totally recommend doing this, you can make your props out of like a model kit material, any plastic bits you have, and then just paint them clay colored, and no one will know the difference as long as your color is correct. It'll just save you a lot of headache trying to draw those perfectly straight lines in clay. If you are going to try representing like metal or plastic props in clay, hit it with that freeze spray just to harden it up so you can chop into it more and at least have a fighting chance to get some hard edges in. Actually, speaking of props made out of model kits, you can see here that weird little tool I'm pressing in there is actually the original flashlight I made out of plumbing tubes. It just had some really weird shapes to it and it wasn't the right size and I couldn't get the color right, so I ended up scrapping it. Here I'm just using whatever tools I can to roll in some hard edges. It was actually a good thing in the end that I made it all out of clay, since I ended up chopping it off at an angle just so it fit the composition of the rest of the model. The whole thing was just too obtrusive at the full size. To mount any prop to your model, just roll up a little piece of clay, melt it, and plug it right on. If you want it to cool faster, like everything else, just hit it with that freeze spray. Alright, I originally was just going to call it quits here, but I figured that if this guy's a soldier, then we really need to sell it, and he's going to need a helmet. So I just blocked out the general shape of a Vietnam M1 helmet. They have a really cool look where they're usually covered in camouflaged fabric and are just loaded with gear and ammo packs. The reason it's split here, as you can see, is I had blocked this out on his head and then cut it down the middle, so when I took it off to work on it separately I wouldn't rip off his ears and hair and stuff. Now that that's all blocked in, I'm going to piece it back together by melting both sides and then brushing out the seam. Next up is the rake pass. I'm going to go in random directions. You'll be able to feel when you're done with this thing when it starts to just glide over the surface without snagging on anything. This is kind of a cool technique they use in the auto industry for modeling those big clay car concepts where they need really large, flat, perfectly smooth surfaces. You just run a flat, bendable sheet of metal over your large area of your sculpt and it just consolidates the clay to one plane. I love using that tool. You feel like a pro auto sculptor when you do it.
Finally, I'll wipe it down with some more Taltine mixture. Remember to air your sculpts out after you've just soaked them with all this stuff. It's super toxic, and the rags are really flammable, so chuck them out when you're done with them. Don't let them build up in a garbage can somewhere. I'm not going to put the folds on his helmet just yet. He still needs his ammo clip and strap, and those will somewhat dictate how those folds are placed. So I'm just going to melt two little blobs and then place on his little machine gun clip. As you can see on that clip, drawing perfectly straight lines in clay and then having them stay straight is not the easiest thing. Actually, this is a good time to mention, and this is a total cheat, but if you've made it to the end of this video, you deserve to hear it. If there's lots of little ding bits or wobbly areas you don't like in your model, and you've just had it with working on the damn thing, you can always revert to Photoshop and clone out any bits that aren't working and modify it in there. You can even use the warp tool, anything that sells it. If you're not going to be showing this in a gallery or anything like that, and you're just putting it on your portfolio, why not make it the best that you can and fix the bits that don't work, no matter what the method. Starting to add in those helmet folds now, just by rolling up large tubes of clay and pressing into the surface pretty firmly so they stick. You kind of go in a zigzag pattern with these things. Once those are on, blend them in with any end of a wooden tool. These may seem pretty extreme looking right now, but they're going to get raked down and blended in and kind of soften into the surface a little bit more. Better to go heavy-handed with this and have the option to take away clay than need to go in and add more. So as I mentioned before, since that strap is holding that fabric on, it's going to need a few areas of indication where it's pinching down on things. So I'm just going to add in a little bunch of teardrop shaped pieces of clay with the pointy points pointing towards the strap, and that's kind of going to indicate where it's kind of pulling that fabric down. Now it's time to rake all these folds down and blend them into the helmet so that it feels like it's all part of the same surface. You can see that one fold is coming off. This is a good reason why you'd want to press it down pretty firmly so that when you start raking over, you can be confident everything's just going to stay in place. Now it's back to the old sock. I didn't spend too much time raking down the cloth since this thing's all fabric. It'd be kind of cool if some of the surface is a bit lumpy. And once that's all smoothed down again, go back in and find any areas that have gotten too soft. You know, where 2 points of the folds meet up, it should pinch there just a little bit. So you can see I'm kind of carving out those areas just to tighten it all back up again. You don't want your sculpt to look too soft all over. Sometimes it's good to really reinforce where the cloth is crimping. So bend up a little tube of clay and place it on that pinch point and then blend it back in. I find this gives the folds a little bit more logic and form, and your eye kind of goes to that pinch point and then it tapers off as it gently, dissipates into the rest of the cloth. So we're nearing the end now. I'm just going to add in a few little final touches, like where his helmet's been sewed together. I'm going to add in a seam there and then blend it in. Once that's done, I'll use the Ziploc bag to put in some small stitch lines, and then finally some dangly straps. These straps you're going to see, same technique as his shoulder ones, just rolling up a flat sheet of clay and imprinting a texture stamp. Alright, on they go, and that'll really be about it. So I hope you guys got some help out of this video. I'm going to do another tutorial on sculpting a bust, pretty much the same techniques, but a very different style of character. So best of luck on making your own awesome, cool little projects. Take care.